different perspective will be great.
So, Mr. Lurie, could you possibly go over your career as a writer, maybe the pathway you took from a student in 5th grade all the way up to now as writing was involved in your life?
Yeah, okay. I'll try to give the short version. In 5th grade, I don't know if I really had any idea what I wanted to do, but by the time I was a senior in high school, I had a teacher that was a published writer and inspired me. And so at that point, I decided that I wanted to be a writer. I wasn't sure like what type of writer. And that was in 1992. So interesting thing to note is that I didn't actually have a piece published and paid for until 2006. So that's a pretty long apprentice phase. That's a long time to be kind of learning to do what you do. Now, I was teaching, Mr. Bain mentioned that I taught high school, so I knew how to write, and I knew how to teach how to write, but as far as getting paid for it, it took a long time. So nonfiction, I kind of stumbled into that. I wanted to write, and I like writing fiction and nonfiction, but it just turned out that I was kind of better at nonfiction. More people wanted to read the things I was writing that were based in reality than things I was making up. So as a professional writer, I've written a few books and a number of articles. I tend to write a lot about music because that's something that I'm interested in. So I wrote a book about a Australian rock band that a lot of people have not heard of. That was my first book. I co-wrote a book about martial arts and karate, so that was a totally different thing. And then I did 2 more books about other musical artists. And I have one on a band that's from Georgia, actually, called REM. And that book is coming out in the fall of 2017. In addition to that, I write a lot of articles for different magazines. And I write about music and also write about some other subjects as well.
All right. So we'll go through a few rounds of just Q&A real quickly. We'll start with the students in Ms. Lancaster's class. Do you have a specific question that you would like to ask Mr. Lurie about writing nonfiction?
About writing nonfiction? Let's see here. Miss Addison, do you want to stand up and say what your question is?
Is it fun writing nonfiction?
Well, that's a really good question. So to me, it's a lot of fun. It just kind of depends if you're wired for it. Some people love basketball. Some people love playing guitar. Some people like swimming. And for whatever reason, I really like writing. And the teacher that I had that inspired me, one of the things is he said, people ask him why he writes, and his response was, I write because I can't not write. Like for him, it was like eating. It was just something that he had to do. So I really enjoy it, and I like doing the research. I like learning about things, and I like telling the world about the things that I've learned. And that's why I was a teacher too for a while. So for me, it's a lot of fun. It might not be fun for everyone, but if you find that you like creating things or you like describing things or you like telling stories, then I think you would find it fun too.
All right, let's move over to Ms. Hannah's class. Ms. Hannah, do you have any questions for Mr. Lurie?
Hello.
Come over here. I see you.
Hi, Ms. Hannah's class. Do any of you guys in there have a question for Mr. Lurie about his writing or your writing?
Yes, how long have you been writing fiction stories?
Well, so you asked about fiction. I did start out writing fiction, and that was back in 1992. So, but primarily what I write now is nonfiction. And I love fiction, but nonfiction I've just been more successful at it. So I don't write a lot of fiction now, but I've been writing, 24 years? So, I mean, I wrote before that. When I was in 5th grade, I would write stories and stuff like that. But as far as trying to be published, it's been since 1992.
Thank you, sir. What about Miss Payne? Miss Payne, do you guys have a question you'd like to ask?
All right, Haley, go ahead.
How many books have you wrote?
If you count the one that I wrote with someone else, it's been 4 books.
All right, back in the back. Yes.
How does it feel to be a nonfiction writer?
How does it feel to be a nonfiction writer?
It feels pretty good. I like being able to say that I do something I love, and people read what I write, and I get paid for it. These are all really, really nice things. It feels really good.
All right, how about back to Miss Lancaster's class?
Nick, you want to stand up and ask your question, please?
Do you travel?
Ask it again.
Do you travel?
To do what? What was your full question, though?
Do you travel to follow bands?
Do you travel when you have to go follow the bands?
Oh, yeah, I do. So I mentioned that the first book was about a group that was from Australia. So I did get to go to Australia and spend a month there, and that was a lot of fun. And this last book, because the band was from Georgia, I got to go back there. In fact, a town very close to where you all are, Athens, I'm sure everyone knows where that is. That's where the band is from. So I got to go back there, and that's actually where I used to live. So I do get to go to fun places to research things I'm writing about. And sometimes I do that on my own expense, and sometimes that's part of the publication.
So, Mr. Lurie, how long does it take you to do your research process, or what is the process of writing a nonfiction book?
Well, it takes a while. It depends. Like, if I'm writing an article for a magazine, they have what's called a deadline. So there's a specific time where you have to have everything completed. So if I'm doing an article, I might only have a month or 2 months to write it, or maybe even a week. You know, if it's like something that's going up on a website. And so in that case, the research has to happen really quick. Maybe a lot of it just happens through Google, or, you know, so the amount of time it takes depends on how much time I have. So the book that's coming out, that's about the band from Georgia, I spent a year researching it. And so what that was, that consisted of me reading everything else that had been written about them, and then also interviewing a bunch of people. And so I spent a full year doing that, and did some travel as part of that. And then I spent 4 years writing it. And so that project took a long time, and there were breaks because there was other things that I was working on in the middle of that. But sometimes I'll write something just over the course of a few days. So, you know, how much time do you have, and then you want to spend about half of that time researching it.
All right, let's go back to Miss Hannah's room. Miss Hannah, what do you have?
What is the hardest part about being a nonfiction writer?
That's a really good question. The hardest part about being a nonfiction writer probably is that you can't make anything up. So it has to all be true. And so you have to spend a lot of time making sure that you've got your facts correct. If you interviewed people, you want to make sure that you did quote them correctly. And going along with that, you have to realize that because it's nonfiction, you're writing about real people with real lives, and their feelings can be hurt by the things that you write. So you want to make sure that you treat people with respect, even if you disagree with them. And I had to, I had to learn that because my first book, I'd never written a book before, and it was hard for me to think about the idea that at some point people would be reading this book. And so I was not as careful with that one. And now I think about that a lot more, that if you say something about people in the book, you have to make sure it's true, but you also want to take into consideration how it will affect their lives. And so if you're writing fiction, if you're making things up, you don't have to worry about that at all because you've made up your characters, you've made up your story. So as a nonfiction writer, you really have to be responsible, and you want to tell the truth, but you also want to be a good human being.
Building on that question, we've drawn a line in the sand, so to speak, between fiction and nonfiction. So how does your own opinions as the author fit into that? So where does the realm of opinion come in your writing?
Well, that's a good question. So in nonfiction, you can break nonfiction down into a couple different categories. And some of these you've heard of, like history. Okay, so history is just reading about events that have happened. Then there's journalism, which is basically the news. And then what I studied was actually called creative nonfiction. So it was taking a lot of the skills of fiction writing and putting it into nonfiction, really kind of trying to be creative with the truth, but still, have it still be the truth. So as far as your opinion, in creative nonfiction, you can be opinionated. In editorial writing, you can be opinionated. But then if you're writing about history or you're writing about the news, you really have to try to have your opinions not be such a big part of it. And I think that as human beings, like, our opinions always are in there somewhere, but you always want to try to tell the truth. And like right now, we're in the middle of a presidential election. So in the news, people that are telling the news, they have to try to not show which candidate they like. They want to try to be truthful about both of the people that are running for president. And so it just depends what type of nonfiction you're writing. Sometimes you can use your opinions, and sometimes you have to try to put those aside.
Okay. All right. Let's move to Miss Payne's room. Miss Payne, what do you guys have for us?
Anna.
What is the funnest part about writing a nonfiction book?
The funnest part about writing a nonfiction book? Probably when it's done and you hold it in your hand. And yeah, actually, let me see if I got a copy of one of my books. I'll show you. I mean, this is the best part of it. So just a second. Okay, so this is this is the book that was written about karate and martial arts, which is kind of a strange cover. Like on the cover, it's like a lily pad and a flower and everything, but that's because it's about the philosophy of martial arts, and a lot of it has to do with like keeping your mind still. So the funnest part about writing a nonfiction book is you spend all this time, like sometimes a couple of years, where it's just words on a screen or words on a page, and it feels like it's never going to end. And then when it's finally done, and you get to hold the book and you realize how much you've actually written, that's a lot of fun. It feels like you haven't been wasting your time.
All right. Back to Miss Lancaster.
All right, let's see. We have so many questions, it's hard to choose. Let's see here. Why don't you go ahead and stand up? Yeah, go ahead and stand up and tell them ask them what your question is. Hey, listen.
What made you decide to go from fiction to nonfiction?
So what made you decide to go from a fiction writer into nonfiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a very random thing that happened. So this was around the time that I knew Mr. Bain. We were both teaching at Claxton High School. And I decided that I wanted to really get serious about my writing and go to graduate school. So I had already gone to college and I'd already studied writing, but I wanted to get a graduate degree in writing. And I wanted to start publishing. And so when I applied to that school, which was in North Carolina, could send a short story, so you could send fiction, or you could send nonfiction. The reason I went into nonfiction is I was looking at the things that I'd written, and I had some stories, and then I had a couple pieces I'd written in college that were nonfiction pieces. And I just thought the nonfiction is better. I have a better chance of getting into the school if I send them the nonfiction piece. And I thought, well, I can always switch back later on. But what happened is I sent that in, I got into the school, and then when I was at that school, that's what I wrote was nonfiction. And so here we are, you know, a decade or so later, and that's still what I'm writing because that's just what I studied. Now, fiction, I still plan to go back to it, but I don't know when that will be. Maybe after the next book, I'll try to write fiction. Another thing I want to say about nonfiction is that when you write about, like a music band, for instance, or if you write about someone running for president, you have a built-in audience, because there's always people that are going to want to read that because they, they know about that subject and they want to learn more about it. When you write fiction, you're not sure if people are going to read it or not because you're making something up. So like look at Star Wars, for instance. Star Wars was a big success, but when he was writing that, he didn't know if anyone was going to be interested in it because no one had heard of it before. So that's kind of the difference. When you write fiction, it's a little more scary because you don't know if you're going to put all this work in and you don't know if someone's going to read it. But then if they do read it and they love it, then that's fantastic. So I do want to get back to fiction.
Ms. Lancaster, you guys said you had a lot of questions, so go ahead and ask another.
Okay. Yes, they're all wanting to ask questions. Let's see here. Journey, we want to stand up and ask your question? Look at this dartboard. Go ahead. You can do it.
Do you write informational books?
Do you write any type of just informational books where you're maybe talking about how to do something? Is that what you mean? Mm-hmm. Instead of just the information about a band? Mm-hmm. Okay. Have you done any informational?
Not yet. That's something I'm kind of thinking about getting into, manuals and things like that, because it's you can get a lot of work doing informational books. The one about martial arts was, I think originally was supposed to be kind of like that, but then we got into more creative sides of it. So no, I haven't really done a lot of that yet. I work a lot in the software industry as well, and so I do a lot of informational writing for that. But that's kind of a whole different skill set. So yeah, I haven't done any informational books yet.
All right, let's go back to Miss Hannah's class and pick those folks back up. Miss Hannah?
Kristen sent up an extra question. Move over, Tristan, so he can see you. Move over that way. Right there.
How many books have you written? I mean, what is your favorite article or book?
Of something that I've written? Or just anything?
Something that you have written.
Something
Okay.
you have written.
Well, you probably see my cat walking around here. He's decided that he wanted to be part of this. Something that I've written, I don't know. It's that answer changes all the time. But I just wrote a review of Bruce Springsteen's new book. So it's basically it's like a book report. But it was for this magazine called National Review, and I just turned that in. And that's probably my favorite right now because it was really easy to write. It was really fun writing it. Like sometimes when you're writing, it's really a struggle and it's a lot of work. And this one didn't really feel like work at all. I read the book and I enjoyed it and I wrote about it. But of the books I've written, probably my favorite is the one that is coming out next year. Because I always look back at the old ones and I think about things that I would want to change or do differently. Because you're always getting better. So for me, my favorite is always whatever I've done recently.
So you mentioned you're always getting better. What advice would you give these fifth graders that what would improve their writing? Is there any tips that you've learned over the years?
Yeah, the biggest thing about becoming a better writer is to just read a lot. find things that you enjoy reading. You know, I mean, the thing about reading is that it shouldn't be work, it should be fun. So a few years ago, everyone was reading Harry Potter. I don't know what is the popular stuff now, but just find something like that that you really enjoy and read as much as you can, because when you read, you're getting a good story, but you don't realize it, but you're also learning. You're learning about how sentences work, paragraphs, and all these things that when you learn them in a textbook, they might seem kind of boring, but when you're reading them in a really good story, you don't even notice, but you're just kind of taking it in. So there's a lot of distractions right now. Like if you want to be entertained, there's movies, there's the internet, there's music to listen to, there's YouTube and all that stuff. But if you want to write, you should make time and read a lot. And then your writing will get better naturally.
I think that's great advice. Thank you, sir. Let's move over to Miss Payne's class. All right, Miss Payne, what do you have for us?
Steven.
What Georgia band were you talking about? That you did?
Well, it's a band called REM, and about 25 years ago, they were one of the biggest bands in the world, but now I don't know how many people know about them. But they're from Athens, Georgia, and I lived in Athens right around the time that they were really famous. I don't know them very well, but that's where I live.
Jackson, go ahead.
How long does it usually take to write a book?
Well, I think it's different for different writers. So for me, it takes a long time because I have other things. I have another job that I do as well in software, so I have to kind of work around that. I have a young daughter, and we have another child on the way. So I only have a limited amount of time to write each day. So the books I've written usually take at least a year. One of them took about 2 years. One took 7. One took 4. And then I have another book that came out earlier this year that was a short book, and I wrote it in 2 months. So it really depends on how much time I have and the subject. But some writers, they're able to do like 2 books a year. The fiction writer Stephen King, he seems to write about a book a year.
All right, we're back to you, Miss Lancaster. Here you are.
Okay, all right, let's see here. One more. Let's see here. You want to go and stand up and ask? Go ahead.
Who inspires you to write nonfiction books?
Very nice. Are you inspired?
Okay, who inspired me to write nonfiction books? That's a really good question. All right, so I'm going to give you 2 answers because I want to tell you about the guy that inspired me to write. He was my high school teacher, and he writes fiction and nonfiction. He's known more as a fiction writer, but he was the first person I'd ever met that had published his writing. He wrote for Sports Illustrated, he wrote for some other magazines, and I just thought that was the coolest thing that I'd ever heard. And he just enjoyed it so much, and he was such a good teacher that he was the person that inspired me to write. As far as nonfiction writers, there's a lot of great ones. So there's another guy that I also studied with briefly, and his name is John Sullivan. And he writes kind of the same sort of stuff that I write. He writes about music, and he also writes about sports. He writes about other things. And he is so good. When you read his writing, it's just like reading a really good story. And so he inspires me as a nonfiction writer. And I could go on, but those are 2 that are big ones.
Okay, we're back to Miss Hannah's class. All right, Miss Hannah's class, give us something.
Do you think you'll ever get bored of writing books?
Do you think you'll ever get bored while writing books?
Yes. Yes, I will get bored, and I do get bored writing books. So that's I have to say this, whatever you do in your life, there will be times where you'll be bored. It's just part of life. But again, when you can hold this in your hands, it's really exciting. So when you have boring times, you know that you have that to look forward to. So think of it like sports. A lot of you probably play sports, right? So when you practice, you get bored sometimes, don't you? When you're practicing, you have to do the same things over and over again, and you have to get better. So being a writer is exactly the same way. And there are times that are boring, but there's other times where it's a lot of fun. And most of the time for me, it's fun.
When you talk about how long it takes you to write a book, tell us about the editing process. How much of that time is it that someone else is writing your book and then telling you how to change what you've written? And how personal does that feel when someone says, you need to change this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So editing is the part that happens right at the end. So after you've written your book or your article, then it goes to someone called an editor, and then you work with them to get your writing just right so that it can come out and not have any mistakes in it. So if you've done homework and you've turned it in and it comes back and it's got marks on it from your teacher, that's basically the same thing. And you get a grade. You know, we don't get a letter grade in the writing profession, but you can kind of tell what the grade is depending on how much they've tried to change it or they want you to change it. So editing is good. There's a writer named Stephen King that some of you have probably heard of, and he said that in one of his books about writing, he said that the best thing that you can do as a writer is find an editor that you really like and stick with them forever. You can't always do that because if you're writing for a magazine, you've got whoever's editing that magazine. But for my books, I've been working with a guy named Steve Connell, and his publishing company is called Verse Chorus Press. We've done 2 books together, and I really like him. And so when he edits, he has a lot of suggestions about things that he wants to change, but I agree with almost all of his suggestions. So it doesn't really hurt my feelings because he has a lot of ideas about how I can make my writing better. And I think the longer that you write, you become more confident. And so when people criticize it, like editors, when they criticize it, you don't take it, it doesn't hurt your feelings as much because you know that they like your writing, they just want to help you make it better.
Cool. All right, let's get over to Miss Payne's class again. Miss Payne, you have the floor.
All right, Miss Izzy.
When did you start writing?
When did I start writing? Okay, so I decided to be a writer in 1992. I actually started writing probably in 3rd or 4th grade. That's when I started making up stories and writing them down. So by the time I was in 5th grade, I was filling up notebooks with stories, and they were like adventure stories, and I'm trying to remember what they were. Detective stories, I guess. I don't know if they were any good. I used to draw comic books too. So because I was a big fan of comic books and superheroes and stuff like that. So I would draw my own comic books, and that's kind of the beginning of my writing, I would say. So right around your age, that's when I started.
Okay, and let's see, Miss. Oh, it looked like Miss Payne had another question. We'll go ahead and do that again.
All right, Kyla.
How long did it take for you to find out that you wanted to write nonfiction books?
How long did it take you to figure out that you wanted to write nonfiction books?
Well, so let's see. When were we teaching in Claxton, Mr. Bain? What year was that? That was 2000.
That was 2000 to 2004.
Okay, so I decided I wanted to be a writer in 1992. I applied for that college in 2002. So it took me 10 years to figure out that I was going to write nonfiction. And it was kind of by accident. But then I just stuck with it.
Just by accident, you say. All right. Let's go over to Miss Lancaster's class. Miss Lancaster?
Okay, let's see. We have another question. You want to go ahead and stand up? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you ever think about writing graphic novels? I mean, narrative books?
I think about writing some type of storybooks again, like narrative writings again.
Narrative writing.
Yeah, actually, I have ideas for 3 novels that I've kind of written some outlines for, and maybe sometime soon I'll start doing that. There's this thing in November each year. It's called the Novel Writing Month, and it's just basically a challenge. A bunch of writers try to write a book in a month. And every year I say I'm going to do it, but then usually I'm working on something else, so I'm not doing it this year. But I have an idea. It's going to be sort of a spy story, sort of like James Bond. And maybe next year or the year after that I'll do that.
Within her question, I think she also mentioned graphic novels.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah, that's something I think about all the time, because that's originally, when I was your age, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write and draw comic books. And I have a friend that actually has his own comic book company, and he publishes comic books. And there's an offer for me to write something at some point. The thing is, I don't know if I would get paid for it. So, and I do write just for fun, but usually if someone is going to pay me for something, or if I'm doing it for free, I'm usually going to go with the one that's going to pay me, because I have to support my family. So I'm sort of waiting for the right opportunity. But yeah, I think I probably will try to write comics at some point, and we'll see how that goes. That'll be fun.
Okay, so I just got a text that we have just a minute left, so it's gone pretty quick. I do want to thank you very much for chatting with us and give us your insight as a nonfiction writer. I did want to ask you one more thing about, you write a lot about music and bands, and I know as a musician you write music. I didn't know if you had just a few seconds you could share, like, the connection between writing your books and writing music.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so there is a connection, and I love music, and I love to create music. I haven't been doing as much music in the last few years because I've been doing so much writing. But I like to think of it in the same way. I think that really good writing, it flows like music. I think the goal of writing is that you want to get information across, but the type of writing I do, you want to forget that you're reading. When you read a book, you want it to be almost like you're watching a movie, or like you're listening to music, where you forget that you're looking at words. And so if a writer has done his job really well, or her job, that it takes you to some other place. And so that's something that music does as well. And I always listen to music when I'm writing, and I would like my writing to be kind of musical in the way that it flows.
All right. So since this was Miss Lancaster's request, we'll end up with her, and as the teacher there, we'll give her the floor to wrap this up with anything she might want to add. Miss Lancaster?
All of the kids are trying to vie for attention and be able to ask one more question. I think overall, what spoke to me that I really liked that you said was the connection between your writing and your reading, and how the more that you spend your time in the written world of reading books, how that pulls you in and can change you as a writer. Is there any book that you like the most, or that means the most in your life?
Yeah, there's a few. One thing I want to say real quick about reading is that if you're not in the habit of reading, when you first start reading, it seems like maybe it's a little bit of work, because it's different from watching TV. But it's just like working out. It's like training for sport. The more you do it, you just become better at it, and it becomes more fun. And so I read a lot. And when I read a book now, it's like better than a movie. It's better than anything else. It takes you completely into that world. So when I was younger, the books I really enjoyed were Lord of the Rings. I'm sure you've heard of those movies. And the thing is, those books are actually really hard to read. I went back and tried to read them not too long ago, and I was surprised that I actually read them when I was younger, because they're kind of dense books. I never read Harry Potter, but everyone seems to love that. So I liked a book. There's a book called The Great Gatsby that I read in high school, and I think that's just a really amazing book. But it might be a bit, I don't know if I would have liked it in 5th grade, but that's a book that really took me to a different place, and also taught me about people. So, and I mean, I can go on and on. There's hundreds of books that I've read that I love, but those are a few.
All right. Well, we really appreciate your time and you just spending the time to discuss your writing with us. So as future writers, we need to say a great thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You all asked wonderful questions, and it's just really a joy and an honor to talk to all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Lurie. We appreciate it.